The big hall of the National Museum of American History sparkled under the warm light of fancy chandeliers. It was a special dinner party to raise money for a new display about American movies. Washington, D.C.'s most important politicians mixed with Hollywood's biggest stars. The room buzzed with quiet talk, the sound of glasses touching, and soft classical music playing in the background. Waiters in clean white jackets moved through the crowds, carrying trays of small, tasty appetizers. One of the night's most exciting guests was Samuel L. Jackson. He moved through the crowd easily, with a natural grace that made people notice him without him trying to show off. He wore a dark, perfectly fitted suit and shook hands with senators, laughed with other actors, and gave warm, real smiles to everyone he met. He was there to celebrate movies, but his mind was also thinking about bigger world problems. In recent interviews, Samuel had been very open about how frustrated he was with Washington politics. He famously said that many of the country's hardest problems could actually be solved quite easily if people just talked. This simple idea had started big debates. Some people praised it as common sense, while others said it was too simple and wouldn't work in the real world. On the other side of the huge hall, Vice President J.D. Vance was talking with a group of people. He was surrounded by his advisors, people who gave him money for campaigns, and eager newspaper reporters. Vance seemed confident and smart, like a college professor. He was known for being very intelligent and having a sharp tongue. He never backed down from political arguments. He had heard Samuel L. Jackson's comments, of course. While he respected Jackson as an actor, he privately thought such ideas were completely out of touch with how hard it really was to run a government. To Vance, real solutions came from policy papers, economic studies, and smart political moves, not from feel-good conversations. Samuel paused by a beautiful display case that showed off classic movie costumes. A young reporter, who had just finished journalism school, walked up to him carefully. She held out her small digital recorder, her hands shaking slightly with nerves. "Mr. Jackson, if you have a moment," she began, her voice a little breathless with excitement. "I'm with the Capital Echo newspaper, and I wanted to ask about your recent statements about political solutions. You said that many problems could be fixed if people just talked. Could you explain that more, please? It sounds very hopeful, maybe even too idealistic, to some people." Samuel turned to her, his calm personality radiating outward like warmth from a fire. He gave her a kind nod that made her feel more comfortable. "Hopeful? Yes, I suppose it is. But what's the other choice, young lady? More of the same old stuff? More screaming matches on TV news? More bills dying in committees because no one can agree on anything? We've been doing that for decades, and look where it's gotten us." He gestured around the fancy room with his hand. "My point is simple. Somewhere along the way, we stopped listening to each other. We started talking at each other, or about each other, instead of to each other. And when you stop listening, you stop understanding. And when you stop understanding, you sure as hell can't find things you both agree on." Samuel's voice got warmer as he continued. "Behind all these expensive suits and big job titles, we're all just regular people, right? We all want our kids to be safe, to have good schools, to have chances to succeed. We all want our neighborhoods to be healthy and our families to do well. And sometimes, the only way to figure out how to make those things happen for everyone is to actually sit down, look each other in the eye, and really talk it through. Not debate to win points, not try to score political victories, but talk like human beings trying to solve a problem we all share." The reporter was writing furiously in her notebook, excited by how thoughtful his answer was. A few other people had started to gather around, drawn by Samuel's calm but powerful way of speaking. Just as he finished, a smooth, confident voice cut in, with a familiar tone that sounded very sure of itself. "An interesting idea, Mr. Jackson. Though, if I may say so, perhaps a bit too simple for the serious matters of running a country." It was Vice President Vance. He had made his way through the crowd and now stood just an arm's length from Samuel. His smile was polite and almost charming, but his eyes showed he was ready for an intellectual fight. He nodded briefly to the reporter, then looked directly at Samuel. "The complicated parts of governing, sir," Vance continued, "the huge budgets, the tricky international treaties, the deeply held political beliefs, these are not matters, I promise you, that can be solved with a simple friendly chat. They need expertise, laws, strategic planning, and often, tough compromises made through hard negotiations. Samuel met Vance's stare, his face showing no emotion. "Vice President Vance. Always a pleasure. Or, sometimes a pleasure." A wave of quiet laughter spread through the small crowd that was quickly forming around them, drawn by the obvious tension in the air. "And you're right, sir, these aren't friendly chats about who ate the last cookie. But sometimes, when you look at these serious matters, you find that the real problem isn't the data or the numbers. It's the basic human disagreement that got lost in all those statistics. And quite often, those disagreements are about something as simple as playgrounds." Vance's eyebrow went up, a flash of real surprise in his eyes. He clearly hadn't expected Samuel to pick up on his subtle insult and turn it around. He saw his chance to make Samuel look foolish. "Playgrounds, Mr. Jackson? Really?" Vance's voice got a mocking tone. "Are you saying the critical infrastructure bill, or perhaps our delicate trade negotiations with other countries, could be solved by talking about swings and sandboxes? With all due respect, that sounds more like something you might hear in a kindergarten class than in the halls of Congress." His tone was still polite, but loaded with barely hidden amusement, designed to make Samuel's idea sound completely ridiculous. The reporters wrote faster, sensing they might witness the actor making a big mistake. Samuel didn't react to the insult. He stayed calm, his gaze steady and unshaken. "Not directly, Vice President. But let me give you a different playground example. Something that touches almost every single community, from the smallest country town to the biggest city. Something that affects the well-being of millions of Americans, but is constantly stuck because of political fighting." He paused for effect, letting the tension build. "I'm talking about the National Public Parks Initiative." The name hung in the air like a heavy cloud. The National Public Parks Initiative was a legislative ghost, a massive bill designed to standardize funding and maintenance for public parks across the country. It had been introduced years ago, praised as a vital step towards social equality and public health, and then systematically blocked by political gridlock. The bill was a nightmare of competing interests. Arguments raged over how to distribute money fairly between huge urban parks serving millions of people and small, neglected rural parks. Debates centered on balancing local control with federal standards, defining need based on population versus park size, and navigating the confusing world of state and local matching funds. It was a headache for both political parties, a complex web of competing interests and political priorities that seemed impossible to untangle. Vance knew all these messy details. His confident smirk flickered for a moment, then came back, now with a hint of challenge in it. "Ah, the Parks Initiative," he said, nodding slowly. "A fine example, Mr. Jackson. A truly huge undertaking. Years of careful expert analysis, countless hours of congressional hearings, piles of population data, millions of dollars poured into economic impact studies, and yet, it remains stubbornly, frustratingly stuck." Vance's voice got sharper, more sarcastic. "And you, sir, believe this incredibly complicated knot of legislative and financial complexity can be cut through by simply talking? Are we to have a national playdate, perhaps, and decide how to distribute billions of dollars based on who can share their toys nicely?" His sarcasm was much sharper now, designed to land a decisive blow and show how absurd Samuel's position really was. Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, sensing the political attack. Samuel L. Jackson didn't flinch. He didn't get angry. He didn't even raise his voice. Instead, he just paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces in the small crowd, the attentive reporter, the curious onlookers, and finally, settling back on Vice President Vance. There was a quiet intensity in his eyes, like a calm ocean that runs very deep. "You know, Vice President," Samuel began, his voice deep and measured, each word chosen carefully, "you make it sound ridiculous, a national playdate. And if that's what you think I mean by talking, then yes, it sounds absurd. But you're missing the point completely. The problem isn't the talk itself. The problem is who's talking, and how they're talking, and what they're really talking about." He took a deliberate step closer to Vance, not aggressively, but as if drawing him into a more personal, conversational space. The crowd seemed to lean in unconsciously. The Parks Initiative is stuck because, somewhere along the way, the conversation stopped being about actual people and started being about political positions. It became about urban versus rural, red state versus blue state, federal oversight versus local control. It became about winning arguments in Washington, not about improving lives in our neighborhoods. Samuel's voice began to gain a quiet power that made people want to listen more carefully. You talk about experts and studies, and yes, we need those. We absolutely need data and research. But data without understanding real people is just numbers on a page. When you look at a park, what is it, really? It's not just an acreage figure on a government report. He paused, his eyes taking on a warmer, more personal quality. It's a place where a child learns to ride a bike for the first time, skinning their knee but smiling with pride. It's where a group of elderly friends gather on a sunny bench every morning, sharing stories about their grandchildren and finding comfort in each other's company. It's where a stressed-out parent can take their kids to burn off energy after a long day, where a young couple has their first picnic and falls in love, where a lonely person finds a moment of peace sitting under a big oak tree. The images he painted seemed to hang in the air, and several people in the crowd found themselves nodding, remembering their own park experiences. The people arguing in Washington? Samuel continued, his voice gaining momentum. How many of them have actually sat on a broken bench in a forgotten park? How many have tried to play basketball on a court with cracked concrete and bent hoops? How many have seen the pure, absolute joy on a kid's face when they finally get a proper, safe swing set in their own neighborhood, a place that doesn't smell like garbage and isn't covered in broken glass? Vance opened his mouth, perhaps to dismiss this as emotional manipulation, but Samuel held up a hand, his gaze unwavering and full of quiet authority. My idea of talking isn't holding hands and singing Kumbaya, Samuel continued, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. It's about bringing together the people who actually live these experiences every single day. Not just the lobbyists with their expensive suits, not just the career politicians with their talking points, not just the activists with their pre-packaged speeches. I mean the actual people whose lives are affected. Samuel's voice grew stronger, more passionate. The single mom in Baltimore who walks 3 blocks with her 2 young kids to get to the only green space in their concrete neighborhood, dodging traffic and hoping the playground equipment isn't broken that day. The retired veteran in Montana who finds peace and quiet walking the trails of his small town's park, where he goes to remember his fallen friends and find some calm in his busy mind. The community leaders in small towns who are holding bake sales and car washes just to scrape together enough money to buy new soccer nets for their kids, because the city budget doesn't have room for extras like sports equipment. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Even the waiters had stopped moving, standing still with their trays as they listened. Imagine this, Samuel said, his voice now filled with a quiet, compelling power that commanded the attention of the entire room. Instead of another high-level committee hearing where politicians debate abstract concepts and funding formulas that nobody really understands, what if we did something different? What if we held a series of real town halls? Not in sterile conference rooms with fluorescent lights and uncomfortable chairs, but in the parks themselves. In a busy city park in Chicago on one day, where families are having picnics and kids are playing soccer. And then in a quiet, almost forgotten rural park in Alabama the next day, where maybe only a few families use it, but it means everything to them. Samuel looked around the room, making eye contact with different people as he spoke. And we invite those community members, the families, the seniors, the young people, the local business owners whose shops depend on foot traffic from park visitors, to just talk. To share their stories honestly. To talk about what their local park means to them, what works well, what doesn't work, what would make it better for their community. And more importantly, to really listen to each other. He turned back to face Vance directly, his eyes piercing but not angry. Do you truly believe, Vice President, that the parent in a crowded city, struggling to give their child a safe place to play and learn, wouldn't understand the basic need for green space felt by a family living in a rural area? Do you think they wouldn't agree that all parks, no matter where they are or how big they are, should be safe, clean, and well-maintained for all American citizens? Samuel leaned forward slightly, his words carrying the weight of deep conviction. When people talk about their shared experiences, their shared hopes for their children's futures, their shared desire for a safe, natural space to relax and connect with their neighbors, the political walls start to crumble. Because it's no longer urban versus rural. It becomes, my kid needs a safe place to play, and so does yours. It becomes, I want a peaceful place to walk and think, and so do you. It becomes, We all deserve clean, safe spaces where our families can enjoy nature and each other." Samuel's voice grew even more passionate, but remained controlled and thoughtful. "And once that common ground is established, once you hear the actual human stories behind the statistics, not just the cold numbers and the partisan talking points, then the experts can come in and do their important work. Then the legislators can write bills that serve real people, not just abstract political agendas. The budget numbers suddenly have faces, dreams, and real-life impacts behind them. The legislation can be written to solve actual problems that real families face every day, not just to score political points on the evening news." He gestured toward the elegant room around them. "Look, we're all here tonight in this beautiful museum, celebrating American culture and history. But how many of the people making decisions about parks have actually spent time in the parks they're debating? How many have pushed their own child on a swing, or helped their elderly parent find a comfortable bench to rest on during a walk?" Samuel's voice became softer, but somehow more powerful. "When you bring people together who share these real experiences, something magical happens. The mom from the inner city realizes that the farmer's wife from rural Iowa wants the exact same thing she does, a safe place for kids to play and grow. The businessman who jogs through downtown parks every morning understands why the retired teacher fights so hard to keep the small-town park clean and welcoming. They all want their communities to have beautiful, safe, accessible green spaces." The room was so quiet you could hear people breathing. Reporters stood frozen, their pens still, their digital recorders held up high, capturing every single word. What they had expected was either a celebrity fumbling through a complex political issue or falling back on generic, feel-good talking points. What they were witnessing was a profound, deeply human argument that cut through all the typical Washington noise like a sharp knife through butter. Vice President Vance, whose confident smile had slowly disappeared completely, stood motionless. His mind, which was used to rapid-fire political debates and logical counterarguments, struggled to find any weakness in Samuel's reasoning. Samuel hadn't dismissed the complexity of governing. Instead, he had shown a different path through that complexity. He hadn't just talked about talking, he had laid out a practical, detailed framework for how that conversation could actually happen in the real world, shifting the focus from legislative battles in Washington to shared human needs in communities across America. Samuel hadn't been naive or simplistic. He had been profoundly insightful, reminding everyone in the room of the very reason government existed in the first place, to serve people, not the other way around. The crowd seemed to collectively hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Several people had tears in their eyes, moved by Samuel's vision of Americans coming together to solve problems. Samuel L. Jackson offered a final, small, knowing smile. He looked directly at Vance one last time, his eyes conveying a message that went far beyond words. In that look was years of watching political gridlock hurt real people, years of seeing simple problems become complicated because politicians forgot who they were supposed to serve. "It's just talking, Vice President," he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper, yet it carried clearly through the absolute stillness of the room. "But it's talking to listen, not to win. It's talking to understand, not to prove you're right. It's talking to find solutions, not to score points. And sometimes, Mr. Vice President, that's the hardest thing of all to do. But it's also the most effective conversation you can have." Samuel paused for just a moment longer, letting his words sink in. "Because at the end of the day, we're all Americans. We all want our families to be happy and healthy. We all want our communities to thrive. And if we can just remember that simple truth, if we can talk to each other like neighbors instead of enemies, there's no problem we can't solve together." With that, Samuel gave a slight nod, a polite farewell to the mesmerized crowd, and calmly turned away. He walked slowly toward a quieter corner of the room where a waiter was setting down a fresh tray of drinks, his movement graceful and unhurried. He left behind a room full of people who were not just impressed, but genuinely thoughtful and moved. Some were wiping away tears, others were whispering quietly to each other about what they had just heard. The Vice President stood there for a long moment, slowly running a hand over his chin, his expression completely unreadable. For several minutes, he seemed lost in thought, perhaps reconsidering some of his own firmly held beliefs about how government should work. For a brief, shining moment, the complicated political machinery of Washington had been bypassed by the simple, undeniable power of human truth and genuine connection. Samuel L. Jackson had walked away having not just won an argument, but having opened minds and touched hearts. He had proven that sometimes the simplest words, spoken with genuine care and wisdom, can indeed be the most profound and life-changing of all. As the evening continued and conversations slowly resumed, many people found themselves thinking about their own local parks, their own communities, and their own neighbors in ways they never had before. The seeds of real change had been planted, not through political maneuvering or legislative tricks, but through the ancient and powerful art of one human being speaking honestly to another about what really matters in life.